if folks as they're speaking can remember, we are recording this for posterity's sake. So when you're speaking, if you could speak into the mic, and anyone from the public, we'd ask to do the same. Matt Roy is running a little late, but he will be here momentarily, hopefully. And Jenna Shu is excused, and she really hasn't been participating in this year's budget cycle, but she is on the committee, and we keep her informed. So we're looking forward to having her back next year. The first item on the agenda is review and accept minutes from the meeting of March 11th, 2024. And Donna, you had later today or today you had circulated, are those new?
Yeah, I just put it in the first.
Gotcha. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I made the adjustment you had asked for, which is I had dropped the 1 and the S and the T,
Right.
but nothing else has changed. So other people may have amendments, obviously, but
I read them and it was the same, there was like 2 highlighted spots. And the one was filling in somebody's name.
that was from that was from the notes that I give to Becky to include.
Okay.
Got that. This is,
Page minutes
Okay.
that we're voting on right now.
but thank you for reading those.
And I was thinking, was it me?
Yes, and I got it. Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't remember your name from last time, but I got it now. So thank you.
I filled it in.
Want to make sure I gave you credit.
I think I solved the mystery.
Yeah, you may. So is there a motion to accept the minutes?
I'm just gonna.
Okay, take a quick look.
Um,
And then if there were any other changes to the notes from the budget, the joint budget discussion, if you can just send those to Becky and to me, I guess, then we can make any changes.
I did red line edits. Most of them were really just spelling, grammar, filling in the name, and then one correction regarding the line where it said computer replacement. It was actually the software
Software.
program. And that was really it. That was the first thing I did this morning, was read them while my mind was fresh, and they were very good notes.
Okay, and do they then get approved by the select board?
So they do go into my regular minutes for the select board, and they would approve on Monday, but we usually sort of pass them back and forth a couple times to just make sure spelling, grammar, content is all good before I pull them into mine. So
Okay,
You're good with that?
I'm fine with that. I just want to make sure that
Yep.
we can access the approved ones on the website.
yes, they're,
You know, when we kind of have to get our heads around it again next year.
yep, they're posted the next morning. So, yep.
Thanks.
I would make a motion to accept the minutes.
I'll second it.
Okay.
All those in favor?
Thank you.
Opposed? Okay,
Thanks very much. Appreciate you.
unanimous. Again, thank you very much for your work in doing the minutes.
Yep, happy to do it.
Always really very good, despite dropping a date or missing a name. And it sounds like Matt's coming up, so we're just gonna wait for 2 seconds. Matt can join us. Hey, Matt, how you doing? Matt, here's the package for you. And Bill, we have, it looks like we have an extra, you don't need a set, do you, Becky? Okay, we have an extra set for you if you'd like. You can follow along. Actually, it's going to be in that order. And we have an agenda too, if you want that. I guess, yeah, there it is. And Andy, would you want like these as well? Yeah. Okay. You go. Thank you. Matt, we just reviewed the minutes and approved them. So your timing is perfect now. And we are going to be working off of this sheet that I distributed, sent around earlier. And really, it's just an extract of Matt's year-to-year spreadsheet showing the changes, which we can refer to if we need to kind of go back and look at previous years. But just for the interest of those of us that are getting older and need larger print, I did it this way. So tonight's primary purpose of the meeting is to go through the different budgets, line item budgets that we, excuse me, not specifically the line item, but the total budgets and breakdown as shown on the spreadsheet that we've seen and gone through with the select board joint meetings. And we are so that's what we're doing here. And I realized I probably should have printed last year's actual against this year's budget, but it does show the change, so you can kind of extrapolate what that would have been. So we're just going to work down and start with general government. Sure. And Matt, we are recording the meeting tonight, so.
Do you mind if I ask a quick question while she's looking?
Yeah.
Yep, so your second item is to discuss the select board stipends. I just want to remind you, in the current general government, what I proposed is what's in the compensation line for current. So if you're gonna have a discussion that might change that, you might need to have that before voting on the general government.
Okay, great. So we're going to skip general government then.
Okay.
And we'll come back to that after we take up the issue of the stipends, which will be after we review the rest of the items here. Unless anyone would like to move that up, and I'm thinking, Andy, do you need to get out of here? Do you need to get home? Or are you here just for that item, or are you here for the whole discussion?
I don't need to be here if you don't need me.
Okay.
I just came.
Okay. No, I was just gonna move up that discussion. If you wanted to be here for that discussion specifically, instead of, we're just kicked it to the end, so I didn't know if you were like, oh,
One that always says, don't raise
okay.
it.
So we'll jump to social human services. There are really no changes there that are being recommended from the previous year. Does anybody have any questions on those items? Okay, so I'm going to take a vote for each one of these categories because we vote the total. So I'll entertain a motion to recommend approval of the social services budget in the amount of $12,350.
That we recommend approval of the social human services budget for $12,300.
Have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll bring it to a vote. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. And I will, just in the interest of brevity, I'll make the motion as I read these things, so you don't have to repeat the motion, okay? Mallet Hall, there's a 21%, 21.2% increase that's driven largely by estimated painting costs of 17,500. And part-time staffing for general maintenance. And it got cut off there. I'm not sure how much that was. Was it 1,000 or?
The general maintenance was about 11,000, 10,900.
Okay. 11,000, okay. And then there was relatively small changes dollar-wise on life safety and utilities. Do we have any questions there? Yeah, you may, absolutely.
Bill Schmidt, Poland Range Road. If I understand this, so you're voting on these items and then there'll be you'll pass these recommendations to the select board? So
No,
next step,
our recommendations go into the town warrant
okay,
as right under the warrant, it says budget committee recommends.
yeah,
They say select board recommends as well, but we're recommending to the town.
Okay.
And in the past, those two amounts are not always the same. Sometimes the select board recommends one thing to the town and the budget committee has recommended something different. But then sometimes they're the same and the select board and the budget committee have made the same recommendation to the town.
I just wondered, it's probably too late for me this year, but it's all new. I might want to see about, an alternate or something for next year, but these numbers, I think as you probably already discussed the whole year, are not sustainable. Yet every year when we go to town meeting, pretty much every time we vote for everything. So this is compounded expenses, 7% this year, 7% next year. I mean, our own personal budgets, you never do that, but we are doing it and many towns are doing it. It's like we aren't able to say, okay, this is, I mean, everybody does their budgets and they do a great job at them. And you do too. Everybody's a volunteer for the most part. But how do we say, can we get to a point where we say, okay, next year it's gonna be 2%, you can have a 2%, that's it. And we have to make the tough cuts. Or just not spending more. How do we get to that? Just a rhetorical question. But yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Oh, wasn't there a year when we did do that? The year of 2020, where there was so much uncertainty. And so I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, we did establish like a percentage and we held tight to that. And I don't remember, I want to say it was 2%.
It was inflation at the time, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we have done that.
Yeah, I think, Bill, you raise a good point. I mean, the challenge for the town and for the voters is to what services do they want? What services do they demand? Are they willing to pay for them? And the reality is that that there are more regulatory requirements that are placed on the town every year. There are just increased costs. I mean, as we all know, inflation has been significant, and we need to compensate employees fairly, otherwise we lose them. So those are you're right, it's a real challenge, and the town also looks at that issue in a broader sense when through the comprehensive plan and that development of the plan. And I think a number of these things, a number of the increases that we've seen and increases that we may see for some significant initiatives in the next few years are reflective of what was passed in response, within the comprehensive plan. So, I mean, sure.
Yeah, I think that's all excellent. Although if the comprehensive plan had also said something about, okay, do this within a budget limited to the 2% increase each year, but we've spent $40,000 on this audio visual system, maybe we would have asked like, all right, is $40,000, is that where we want to spend our money or should we spend it somewhere else? For example, there's so many things in the comprehensive plan and those are wants, but when you put a price to it, do you really need it or should you be buying it? So.
Oh, can I just make a comment that the AV equipment was paid by a grant? So that was not taxation, just so for clarity.
But that grant that came from was a part of money could be used a lot.
But it had very specific, it was ARPA, so it didn't have a very broad scope of what we could use it for. It was meant for communications for towns that are underserved, which Pownell really fit into that bill, which is why we applied. So.
Everything like this AV system, anything that's free, for example, the community center, if we get that for free, there's a cost.
Mhm.
There's a cost to maintain this. There's a cost to maintain anything that's free. So we have to factor that, not only the free cost, but then the follow-on costs, which I'm sure you talked about too.
No, I think that's a good point, and I think actually, Paul made that as well last week.
Yes.
Right, he pointed out, he actually gave us a list of things that they've thought through and realized are maybe not capital, but their operations costs. And that was one of the things he put on that list, was maintaining as the example, was maintaining the system you're talking about. So I think that's he raised that as well as a concern.
You go.
No, I think your observations are helpful and it's good to challenge, and it's good for us to hear those challenges. I'm gonna resist the urge to get into a philosophical discussion tonight with it, because I think I could go both ways on that. So, personally, I share some of your thoughts, but at the same time, I've seen a lot of changes here in town that are required, that have forced some of these changes. So,
So, one other thing I would
Yeah.
say is, Bill, is that the last year and this year, again, we combined the meetings. We do a joint meeting with the select board and the budget committee. And what it did is it consolidates the discussion into like maybe 3 meetings, 2 meetings. How many did we have? Three.
Yeah.
So, and I'm just bringing that up, and you were at the last one, right? Because I think it makes it more accessible for people in town. It's only 3 meetings to be able to come and actually hear the detailed discussion presented by the department heads. Because I think there's probably 2 ways. One is to do what you said and say, here's a cap, the most will go up is X. But another way is to actually ask questions and bring up challenges as we go through the decisions, because they go through, you saw last week, huge amount of detail. So I just wanted to add that we're trying to make it very accessible for people to come and participate and see that deeper detail and have the chance to say, is this the right way for us to spend our money, which is an easier way to do it than just looking at like a total and a percentage at the very end after we've gone through everything. So thank you for being here last week.
Yeah, I would just add too, I love the participation. I think just thinking about this year too, I think it's important with the budget, right, to look over the span of, call it 5 years and look at, because there's ups and downs over that period. And certainly with, COVID, things changed and obviously the macro environment changed quite a bit. And then not to be myopically focused on this year, but I think as we go through, you'll see, there aren't that many discretionary items in here, right? There's a lot of, 2/3 of the increase this year is driven by compensation. And I think like Bo said, right, it's difficult to attract and retain folks for municipal work. And we have very, very good, probably the best people. Right. And so that's a big part of it, but also some things that are somewhat out of the control of the town too, right? Like the change with Casella Waste is a big component this year as well. And then with the capital fund as well, right? Just the cost to replace a lot of those items like Paul went through is increased significantly. So, but yeah, I think generally I'll try to stay out of the philosophical conversation too, Bo. Although I'd like to. Yeah.
it's an ongoing discussion, I think, the town should be having, so.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was kind of chairing another meeting on the side. It just got over, so that's good. Okay, so did we vote on Mallett Hall? I don't think we did. Okay, any other questions on Mallett Hall?
No, I'm not sure you actually formally made the motion though.
I haven't.
Okay.
Okay, we had discussion. I'll make a motion then that the budget committee recommend approval of Mallett Hall budget $48,900, a 21.1% increase from last year. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion?
Yes, I should have asked this before, and you probably said it. The 17,500 is an estimate, correct? Just like last time?
That is correct.
Because in the end, it didn't really cost us what we estimated.
That is correct. So we had not gotten the estimate. He did get us the estimate long after we were through budget season. It came in less. So that was for the front.
Right.
So I had reached out several times. He was supposed to come look at the job and get me an estimate. I haven't gotten it. So I took, so we're trying to do the parking lot side this year. So I took the amount from last year and doubled it, and I still have not got a hard estimate from him yet. So I'm hoping I'm close.
Okay, so what I hear you say is if we do have an updated figure by town meeting, we may be able to have the motion be for less than that, less than the total.
That's correct.
So we'll have to keep an eye on that one.
Because that's primarily, I think, what's driving this increase, right? We had 10,000 in there last year for the
So
front.
it's almost entirely the paint.
Yeah, yeah. So it's the painting, right? Thank you. That was my discussion.
Okay. And again, just to reiterate that that was a discussion point with CIP committee as to whether some of these ongoing and periodic maintenance items that can be significant should be, if not factored into the CIP model, but maybe a separate model, looking at those and basically have a sinking fund to set up like the capital projects fund to cover major maintenance items like that, that can be somewhat predicted in the timelines. Okay, any further discussion on Mallet Hall? Seeing none, I'll bring it to a vote. All those in favor of Mallet Hall, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Mallet Hall passes. Breathes a sigh of relief. Public safety. We have a number of changes there. The total amount being sought is $184,839. We have some contractual increases. We have a decrease in the admin side, having gone from a purchase now to maintenance fees, maintaining the new computer system, if I remember correctly. Compensation, we have increasing of stipends, and there are additional folks on the fire department now, as well as just volume of calls. Buildings, really that's relatively minor increase, and operations are primarily new protective gear for new hires and replacement of older gear. And I think that would be one predictable replacement gear for the fire department, where it can be rather significant in terms of the total amount per set, might be a candidate for that
OpEx.
OpEx
Yeah.
fund. Yeah, I think it's a good term for it, OpEx fund. Discussion?
Can you just remind me, the rent is because the fire station is on church-owned land?
Correct. The fire station here on Elmwood is on church-owned land. And they didn't charge the town for anything. But the town was also not taxing them for the house that is next door that is owned by the church. But since that is not religious in its use, the town has to tax that. So when it started to tax it, the agreement was, okay, you're gonna tax us, we're gonna charge you rent, and they basically equal the same. So it becomes a wash.
Okay.
Okay, but it shows up as an greater expense here. Is that correct, Becky?
That is correct.
And the other firehouse in like North Pownell, that is town-owned?
Correct.
Correct. Any other questions or comments on public safety? Seeing none, I'll bring it to a vote. All those in favor of the Budget Committee recommending support of $184,839, which is an 11% increase for public safety, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, unanimous. Moving on to Public Works. That total is $948,670. A $66,670 increase, which is 6.7%. Driven largely by cost of living increase in comp, as well as paving and a new part-time position. Any questions there? Okay, bring that one to a vote. All those in favor of the,
You wanna do it?
let me make the motion. I move that Budget Committee recommend town support $948,670, a 7.6% increase for fiscal year 25 budget. Do I have a second?
A second.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Unanimous. Thank you. Okay, solid waste. Solid waste is, total is 153,223. That's $23,000 increase, or 17.8%, and that's largely driven by having to go to two bin system, which is a function of our contract with Casella, which basically will force the cost of that bin system, the bins themselves, over over 3 or 4 years onto the town, as well as potential impact on fees, recycling fees, solid waste hauling, and a reduction in expense on the paper tag sales, but we also don't get the revenue from those on the revenue side.
Oh, question. So where is I know we went over the revenue and I captured it, the suggestions that you made about how to take a conservative approach that will make it less complicated at the meeting. Where is the revenue on here?
So the revenue would actually fall under my budget
Okay,
revenues, and
okay.
we left that at zero.
Okay.
So that was in my presentation. So it is separate
Okay,
from this.
because as you pointed out, and I just think it's worth noting again, that the cost of this change is not just this cost, but also the loss of the revenue,
Correct.
which if you add them together is pretty significant.
I think you actually
I
put it in
did, I
your
put the
notes.
little
Yeah,
math
you
right
did
in there. I tried to
was-
get Bo's math in there.
That
so-
was very good.
Yeah, here it is. So I had the town will face a net increase of cost of $48,700 for solid waste, with an estimated $42,000 being driven by Casella's requirement that we go to the two-bid system. And that $42,000 is a combination of an increase in solid waste hauling minus the cost of the bags plus the lost revenue. So that net impact is 42,000. And then there's also tipping fees are going up, and there's other things that make the difference up between the 42,000 that's primarily driven by Casella and the total increase for solid waste. So I just wanted to point out that this is only part of the picture, that there's actually additional cost to us because we're losing revenue.
Right, and I think here's a good example of not having a lot of control because of one, because of the contract with Casella, but just the need to deal with waste in town. But it certainly warrants a good hard look, saying, should we be doing different? Can we be handling trash differently in town? is there a completely different approach that would help cap these expenses? Or reduce the cost to the town or to the taxpayer? As a bit of an aside, I will note that we are not unique in the solid waste challenge. Every town is facing this one. I was just reading about two towns down east, Donington and Deer Isle. The largest increases in their budget were due to solid waste. They're down to one spot that they can take their stuff. It's way inland and they have their hands tied and they have absolutely no choice at all. And it's just, it's a real problem. So I think that's a good initiative for the town to be looking at. And I think the Solid Waste Committee has that on their radar.
Yep. Agreed.
Especially next year, you could expect the same, so we're the only town that does not have any security cameras. So we'll probably be required at some point to have security cameras.
And-
Yes.
And other towns are choosing, neighboring towns are choosing to continue with the pay-as-you-throw bags, even though they will have to use the two-bin system as well, as a way to kind of have the people that throw out, households that produce the most solid waste, still paying for the increased solid waste. But it's an additional cost to each household on top of the tipping fees.
Andy?
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself, please?
Andrew O'Brien, Upper Minot Road. I do know that Yarmouth is using the pay-as-you-throw bags, but they also randomly inspect the bins. We don't have the manpower to go out and do that. So I just,
So while you're up there, so I'm just thinking back on the discussion we had last week. Have we decided that we're not going to?
that will have
Because
to,
for us, it's a wash, to your point, right? The way we do the pay as you throw is it's a wash. We don't make anything off of it because we only charge people what it costs to produce, right? So,
and cover the tipping fees.
and cover the tipping fees. Thank you. So there is, I suppose, an option for us to make it a little fairer by still requiring that people have bags, increasing the cost of the bags to generate a little revenue. Has that even been seriously considered? I'm not saying I'm for that, by the way.
It's,
wondering.
it's basically an ordinance and it would have to be voted up or down at town meeting. I guess it isn't an ordinance, but it was voted to do the pay as you throw bags back along to cover the tipping fees.
We're gonna repeal that
So we would have, it may not get repealed.
or amend it.
So
Well, because I think that also ties to what Bo raised last week, which is that will the town have an actual requirement? No, this is a little sideline, but have an actual requirement that bags must be used, whether they're pay as you throw or not, so that we don't have, so that gray and white cat isn't dragging garbage from your house over to his.
it might.
Recognize Becky?
So I actually worked on the solid waste ordinance language exhibit. And I did put a bag being a requirement, not a town-owned bag. I struck that language out, but kept a bag as a requirement in those bins. I mean, as a homeowner, I wouldn't want to clean that bin like it would get really messy. So the exhibit that will be coming forth to the select board in the next couple of weeks as we go through the draft warrant will show that was my suggestion in the language that I worked on last week. Can I make another quick point while I have the floor?
May.
Both Heidi and I forgot to mention that there is grant money that Casella and the town are working on that's offsetting the cost to these bins as well. So that 115,000 contract includes this anticipated grant money, or that would have been substantially higher. It's covering almost 40% of the cost of the bins. So we forgot to mention that at the presentation last week, and I just wanted to get that out in the minutes as well.
And that's built into I'm sorry, Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, so do we run the risk of not having enough money in the budget? if
No, I
the
think
grant
they're,
Doesn't come through, or?
I think they're pretty guaranteed we're gonna get that.
Guaranteed.
Yeah, we were working on the grant application today between me and the rep, so I think it's a pretty solid.
Where's the grant from?
I would have to go check my notes downstairs to quote the exact, but Casella
state.
Works, it's a recycling grant that helps offset the cost of the bin. So it's basically really paying for the recycling bin and not the trash bin so much. So but not all of it, but it's almost about a 40% savings in cost over the 4 years.
So it's a one-time grant spread across.
Spread
the 4 years,
across.
Something that we could reapply for, or that we'll have to reapply.
We wouldn't need to, yeah. And this is for the purchase of all households plus some extra sets that will be needed when some get lost or destroyed.
So Jennifer, your question implies that next year we'll see a significant increase in that just because was the grant applied to just this year, or is it applied across the life of the contract?
It's, so the cost of the bins is over 4 years and then the grant is over the 4 years.
Spread over-
The significant increase you could see is after this year, our contract cost is based on whatever the consumer price index is of recycling and solid waste. So we're not gonna even know that number until January, February of what the next 3 years of the contract cost will be. Plus the carts. Because we're spreading that out over 4 years.
And just from a historical perspective, years ago, we had a private hauler in town. And he served the town very well. But he retired and there was no one else but, well, there was someone else besides, because there was Waste Management, I think at the time, was willing to bid on it, but basically it came down to Casella Pine Tree, which was then bought by Casella. And so we really had no choice. At the time, however, there was serious discussion about going in with Freeport. And when there was about the same time they were working on their improved transfer station, and whether the town of Pownell wanted to contribute to that and provide that as a possible avenue for waste disposal. That was not pursued. The voters decided not to pursue that at that point in time. And eventually we morphed into the pay per tag system, which was an attempt to control waste costs, to not force, but encourage recycling, and to shift some of the burden for excessive waste onto the users. Basically, pay per tag is a user fee in many respects. So that's some of just the history of how we're ended up with Casella and ended up with this system. It'll be interesting to kind of revisit that through the Solid Waste Committee as to what the options for the town might be at this point.
And did Heidi specify that they were going to be looking into use of a transfer station? I know there's a 4-year contract, but did she say they were going to be researching that?
That's on their radar. They haven't
Okay.
done to develop a transfer station is
Oh, I meant using Freeports.
that I think would be part of the discussion. I'm not sure she said it specifically. Obviously, you'd have to get some buy-in by
Yeah.
Freeport. But if it's worth their while financially, it might make some sense. Any other discussion on solid waste? Okay. I move that the Budget Committee recommends support for the $153,223 solid waste budget, a 17.8% increase. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimous. Town Center Water District. There is a 8.8% increase there, increase in the town's expense by $500 to $2,500 and slight reduction in utilities. Any discussion on those or on the Panel Center Water District budget for this year? Okay, I move the Budget Committee support the Town Center Water District budget of 3,700, or the town's portion of the Panel Center Water District budget for $3,700, an 8.8% increase. Do I have a second? Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimous. Cemetery. Total is $6,000, $1,000 increase for 20% increase for cemeteries with a breakdown as shown. Do we have any discussion on that? Okay, I suspect they're gonna be mowing earlier this year than they have in the past. I move that the Budget Committee support the cemetery's budget for $6,000, a 20% increase from last year. Do I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, passes. In the debt service, this is the one high, bright star here. We see a decline in debt service as the bonds get paid off or come down in balance. The total is $271,164, a 2.9% decrease. I'll note that the 2007 fire truck bond is still showing up on the spreadsheet, but it was paid off a number of years ago. But that line item just keeps appearing because we have the history of it off on the left, but that's why it shows nothing there. Any discussion there? Questions? Okay, all those yeah.
Was there, just remind me, I know 300,000 is the point where you can do a bond. You asked, right? Go ahead.
Now, $300,000 is the point within the CIP committee process that if the expense for the item that needs to be purchased, the capital item that needs to be purchased, if it's under $300,000, it comes out of that fund. If it's $300,000 or more, it gets bonded, which does not come out of that fund. So that fund is looking at the non-bonding items.
Was there, but what did I believe you asked Paul, did he anticipate anything being bonded? And I believe his answer was no.
Correct.
So we won't be adding to this. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, specifically what I asked was based on regulatory changes, was there any thought to having to actually accelerate some of the larger purchases to save some money by a year or two because of increased costs in diesel engine emissions controls and things like that. But it didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So
I remember that part. Okay, thank you.
yep. Any other questions on that? Okay, seeing none. I move that the Budget Committee support, recommend approval of $271,164, a 2.9% decrease for debt service.
I'll second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That is approved. Capital Project Fund. This is the yearly contribution into the fund And the amount being sought is $155,000, or an $11,000 increase from last year. And last year, we also had support into the fund from a transfer from surplus or undesignated funds. But this is what would come out of taxation, so it'd be $155,000, and driven largely by a 6% projected inflation rate as it flowed through the CIP model and inflated the costs across the board and showed that the CIP budget, or that fund, was going to be coming up short in certain years. So it was deemed and needed to increase it. Any further discussion or any questions on that?
I just wanted to say, over the course of the next couple of select board meetings, the select board will be discussing transferring from unassigned funds, again, having a warrant article to the CIP. They will also be entertaining a similar warrant article, pulling from the unassigned fund balance to help with taxation. John and I were talking about that today as we were going through the draft. He just wanted to make sure that you were aware that they're going to be discussing that over the next couple of meetings.
Okay, and that would be an up to amount.
It'd be an up to amount.
Okay,
Mhm.
on the taxation.
So will
Correct.
that then change the numbers? The number that we're looking at here, would that then change if it's approved to transfer money from unassigned?
I think the CIP committee would say no. And the reason, and I can't speak for them, but I believe that the reason they would say no is that even at 155,000, the fund is still projected to come up short. And the select board saw that and said, we've got to, supplement that and to help. close
They've done that for the last 2 years. Yeah.
I don't know that it would close it completely, but is that correct, Andy?
That is.
I think you might be remembering the first year with some transfer, they were able to lower the appropriation slightly 2 years ago to just offset that, but their model is showing they're not able to do that now.
Okay, any further discussion there? Okay, seeing none, make a motion that the budget committee recommend approval of $155,000 transfer to the capital project fund, which is a 7.6% increase from last year. Second?
Second that?
Okay, any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, we'll take a vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed? Okay. Other taxation funded items, and this was a request for the Economic Development and Sustainability Committee for $15,000 to support their ongoing committee work. And if I remember correctly, was that for the water survey?
Water survey. Can I?
You may, by all means.
So they have obtained a reimbursement grant. You spend $40,000, you get 30,000 back. 25,000 was already allocated in last year's town meeting, which will be under contract and will be carried forward. And the 15 is to offset that. So there will be $30,000 coming back to the,
And that comes back to the general fund, not
right,
general revenues.
right.
But we have to spend it first.
So just a quick, we had a workshop with the town planner where we discussed unassigned fund balance for that money coming. So
Right, that may be That's what I would recommend is that we take that from unassigned fund balance and then put it back.
So
You
that
know,
wouldn't necessarily be taxation at that point.
Wait, say that, I'm not, can you, don't go away yet. Stay.
Sit, stay.
Go ahead.
Good.
There you go, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that what we vote on is not necessarily come from taxation or from, except for the case of the capital projects fund and the other ones as well, but we're not designating where the funds come from in our
Correct.
recommendations, so folks are clear on that. We're opining on the expenditure itself.
Regardless of where it, or not specifying where it comes.
Yeah, cognizant that if it's not coming from surplus or a grant, it's gonna come from taxation. Yes. Yeah.
But I was told to stay.
Yeah, thank you.
Am I okay now?
No. I just want to make sure no, you're not okay yet. I just want to make sure I understand. So the grant that has been secured, we spend the money first.
It's a
And
reimbursement
then they
grant,
reimburse us.
right?
How does that connect to this $15,500? So it would, say that part again, it was split between 2 years?
Yes,
Okay.
we were granted $25,000 at the town meeting last year.
Okay,
By the time this town meeting rolls around, we should be under contract with someone and would carry that money forward to this coming fiscal year. Along with the
the
15
15,000. So this is.
to
gonna be-
cover the $40,000 and then we would get a $30,000 reimbursement.
I get it. But the 30,000, and so we're not, and Bo, your point is we're not specifying where this 15,000 is coming from, but we are expecting that the $30,000 rebate would go into, did you say surplus?
Well, it just comes back into the town.
This comes to the town and then there's a decision about where it goes.
Well, it automatically goes into undesignated funds.
Undesignated, okay.
It's the same as unassigned.
Unassigned.
Correct. Or surplus or
It's like 3 words.
everybody has a different word for it.
We're calling it unsurplused.
The legal term for the warrant is unassigned fund. Yeah, but most of the time people are saying undesignated or surplus. So I try to use unassigned to get us used to, so you see the language on the warrant matching, but
We will try to use unassigned.
Thank you, Select Person O'Brien.
I have
You're
a
welcome.
question, O'Brien. Do we know before the town meeting whether or not the select board will have approved or not the taking money out of unassigned to pay for this 15,000? Is it something that has to go?
The select board will recommend that it come from unassigned balances, but it has to be voted on at town meeting as such. We can't just wave our magic wand and
So when you make that recommendation, you specify as to where the money would come from.
it would be in the warrant article.
Which is different than what we're recommending. We wouldn't specify the source.
You're just recommending whether or not to expend those funds, not the source.
Right, and actually in the recommendation, right under the warrant article, we can say that. The planning, the budget committee is just recommending the expenditure be incurred and not opining on the. Where the money is coming from in this case. Which is what I think we want to do. Because that way it gives leeway. If if for whatever reason, the warrant, the motion calls for it to come from taxation. I mean, it's not, it could come from either. Yeah, okay, so here's a question, and I don't know the answer to this as, I'm embarrassed to say, as having been moderator in the past. If a warrant article specifies where the money is to come from, can that be modified at town meeting to have that amount come from a different source.
I think it can because it happened the year before. So we had an article that was supposed to come from unassigned fund. And we had a resident stand up and had worked on the unassigned fund balance policy and discussed that that didn't fit the criteria. And I believe the article was amended to come from taxation then, but originally had been unassigned fund.
Okay.
That was 2 town meetings ago, so the year before, 2022.
Right, so number one, the select board, if they're recommending anything coming from unassigned, needs to make sure their recommendations is compliance with that policy. And 2, I think I'm gonna ask that question of MMA because and follow my logic here. If an article is written to spend $15,000 and we are not able to increase that amount at town meeting because that's what's been published in the warrant. And the reason you can't change that is that voters may have read the warrant and say, I'm comfortable with that. I'm not even going to go to the meeting. That's fine with me. I'm not worried about it. Under the assumption it's coming from taxation. And if all of a sudden you basically are changing the intent of the article by saying it's coming from a different source in the same way that you're increasing the amount of the request. I need to, I'm articulating it out loud just so I can. I'm just gonna make a note to
You'll
myself.
take that away.
Excuse me?
You'll take that away.
I'm gonna ask, I'm gonna check with MMA.
Probably a big, more significant issue when it goes in that direction versus the other direction. But it isn't changing.
Right. Yeah, I could almost see it being okay to go from taxation to unassigned
Yeah.
versus having been unassigned and all of a sudden you're throwing it on taxation, right? Okay. So we're gonna go back to,
We need to vote on that.
I think you're probably right. I move that the budget committee, recommend the $15,500 other, well, in this case, it's other taxation funded, balance. All those do I have a second?
I'll second.
I mean, the way it's titled is it's coming from taxation.
That's why I just wanted to say we've had a couple discussions about where it might be coming from. The 500 for the recreation would be taxation for certain, but the 15,000, the select board was entertaining unassigned fund.
Okay, so I'm going to,
So why don't we?
who seconded that?
I did.
Okay, if you withdraw your second, I'll withdraw the motion and I'll rephrase it. So I move that the budget committee support the expenditure of $15,500 of up to $15,500 for Economics Development Sustainability Committee and the Recreation Committee's requests. Period. Do I have a second? Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimous. Thank you. So we're gonna move on to stipends. And look,
Okay.
you sure can.
Would it be used, Matt, could you just,
Would you just recap what you were saying at the beginning of the meeting and said in our meeting last week about the big buckets and where?
So looking at for the total year, compensation increases, so the total increase, $156,000 roughly. Compensation was about 2/3 of that increase spread across the various departments. And then the other notable impacts this year were the solid waste program, which we discussed at length. The fire department gear added a sizable amount, and then the capital fund and economic development request were two other items.
So it was 156,000 overall. That's a 7% percentage change.
7.1, yep.
Okay. I think I'll put that in summary, okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Thank you for doing that, Matt.
That'd be great. Okay, we ready to
Stipend,
move back to the social, not social, human services. General government, including stipends, and Andy is leaving. You're welcome to stay.
thank you.
You are back
Really
there.
appreciate all your
Thank you.
comments.
I know.
Bill, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
My personal feeling is keep it the way it is.
Duly noted. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm only taking that.
Select person O'Brien.
Okay, so we're back to general government. Before we jump into the compensation, do we have any other questions about, the, other general government items? Again, we're just voting on the total, but we're feeling now.
Just one comment on the, we're going over the other taxation funded items, which we're now saying are just other generally funded items. I guess as you're thinking about that, it might make sense to include like some kind of magnitude threshold. So if it's, less than $10,000 or something, then maybe there's not a need to specify where the funds are coming from.
Can you say that again, Matt?
Well, I thought, unless I misunderstood, I thought you were taking away an idea that for certain items, we should be aware of where those are being funded from for the purposes of the budget. If it's taxation funded or unassigned.
Yeah, I don't, yeah. Why I have the mic on. What I'm struggling with on that, or trying to reconcile, is that the budget committee is making recommendations on the expenditures. We don't opine on revenues, although we may voice an opinion, we don't vote on those formally. And we don't vote on necessarily the support for discretionary items that the select board wants to put forward on the warrant, such as a transfer from unassigned funds to CIP for smoothing purposes or something like that. That being said, the implication is it's all coming, it's coming from taxation otherwise, unless there's a grant. We've talked about grants so that we get into that discussion anyway.
Yeah.
I think there is a danger though in the budget committee trying to dictate where the money comes from. I mean, I think that in large part becomes it becomes a challenge for the select board and for Becky when they sit down to try to do the tax rate and figure out what the tax rate's going to be, because they don't know how much necessarily they're going to pull from surplus at that point. And kind of it starts to come out of the same pot.
Yeah.
At that point. And so I don't want to tread on their toes and try to restrict them in that process. That's happened in the past, and that has become a problem if we try to micromanage
Got it.
where it's coming from.
Okay, yeah, I agree with your point of view.
Other questions on the general government?
Yes, should we, I'm gonna capture that. Obviously in the notes, but I think that's like a really important point. Right? And I'm just wondering if there's any, if we need to do anything more formal to, other than just putting it in the notes, to establish that our recommendations are for an expenditure, not specifically designating where that goes. Because to your point, I think the assumption would be taxation, which is kind of the default, I guess, right? Do we want to make a bigger point of this? Do we want to have this as being,
I think from a practical standpoint, that, correct me if I'm wrong, Becky, but if we don't identify in the warrant article or in the motion on when the motion is made, if it's not identified that it's coming from taxation or surplus unassigned, then it's coming from taxation.
It's the terminology used at the beginning. So if we say raise and appropriate, raise means coming from taxation and appropriate means
That's-
spending.
that's-
So it's the wording that we use and the action at the beginning of the article. So if we're taking from unassigned, it would say to transfer from unassigned fund balance, X amount of dollars for the purpose of. If it's taxation, it's going to say raise and appropriate are the typical terms.
And we say recommend.
We recommend approval.
we recommend,
Correct.
right? The warrant will say.
Yeah, so on the bottom of each article, if both you and the select board agree on the same amount, it says the budget committee and select board recommend approval. If you have different amounts, then I'm going to say budget committee recommends X amount,
Right.
select board recommends, which we've had in the past. And then if it's a warrant article that the budget committee doesn't weigh in on, for example, surveying town property using impact fees, it just says select board recommends approval. So that's kind of the designator of where you weighed in and versus where you both actually weighed in versus where it was just select board at that point.
And the raise and appropriate or transfer, that language is being generated or decided upon by you and the select board.
No, that was decided upon in the 1800s when town meeting, it's really old school language. Yeah, it's very old school language. And once the draft warrant kind of gets put together, it goes to the attorney and she goes right through it all. So, and vets it and updates and changes and gives me recommendations. So I know by the time it's going through public hearing, it's already been vetted by her and it's legally written the way that it's supposed to be
So,
written.
and just to clarify, so is that language raise and appropriate, is that actually in the warrant? Or I know, because I had to say it like a million times last year, or 30 times. I got worse as time went on. Or is that part of how I was making the motion, but it's not in the warrant?
So it is in the warrant. So the articles would start to raise and appropriate
Okay,
300,000 for the
that's
general
fine.
government. I think what we started for sort of efficiency's sake, it was, Bo as a moderator was reading it and you were saying, I motion as written, actually, I think was what we did to just move through the
Yeah, he
articles
only let me
faster.
off the hook on
So-
like 4 of those.
But I think that the discussion is a good one because it does imply that we're recommending it come from taxation or
Right,
whatever.
we're in the bottom.
But that is
Recommended.
the language that has to be on the bottom that says that the budget committee recommends approval. So I think it's kind of a known fact mostly that you're recommending the amount and not necessarily sort of the
I
driver
mean,
of where it's coming
if we
from.
wanted to, we could tweak that language and say the budget committee recommends the expenditure.
Mhm.
The amount of the expenditure. That way, we're not saying it's going to be coming from taxation or wherever, unless it's, you know, if the CIP committee had, you know, there was a warrant recommending the expenditure of up to X dollars for a new dump truck, then we would recommend approval for that because we know it's specifically coming from that. And that's,
So I have a 2 PM meeting with the town attorney tomorrow, and if I can remember, I might slide that question at the end and say, what, you know, what does it mean?
Striking the different, it's not like we're trying to make a point right now. We're really not, but it's such an interesting distinction to me.
Mhm.
that we're not calling the you know, and we had someone here tonight really asking great questions, right? So I think our role should be clear to people.
Correct. I agree.
Which has come up in years past, because even when John Green was part of the committee, we spent time talking about how the budget committee was even created and sort of the language behind the purpose of the budget committee and the distinction of roles, basically, between the select board and the budget committee. And it is really interesting. And I don't know that it was ever really, I mean, didn't somebody actually find like the original document? It's like in the basement.
I don't remember. I know John Green had a lot of history because we spent some time talking about funding the warrant articles too, and had some lengthy discussions about how that really sort of ties the financial. That would be all I would be doing all day, is really monitoring the money, finding out what bill I could pay. And so that's why we do our articles where we have, here's our expenditures, here's our revenues, and it's just a really simple math problem. I mean, the net end is the same, so you can make it a really complex warrant article and saying, I'm gonna fund general government from excise tax and BOD and this, you know, or you can just say, here's our expense, here's our revenue, and here's our net taxation for collecting. So just try to keep it simple.
Okay, if you could just more somewhat idle curiosity, you know, and you have time with the town attorney, just explain that we're not, you know, we don't necessarily make recommendations as to the source of the funds. We're recommending, you know, support of the expenditure or not. So, and see if.
Is there
see
any way
how our
for us to
language looks.
represent that differently?
Right,
Okay,
more succinctly.
yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? And you're shut off, by the way. No more questions from you, Becky. Just kidding. Okay, on the one item that we deferred to was the select board stipend. And what has been built into the proposed budget of in total for the general government of $564,171 was a 3% increase in the stipends for all of the members. And I put together this quick spreadsheet showing the history and with a comment section, and I don't know if you saw my email to
I just added it. I'm sorry.
great, okay, good. Yeah, I just thought it would be a good way of including this tab in our worksheet so that we can kind of look back and see what those decisions were made, because we've lost that history, you know, without an awful lot of research. So that's what I've done. And I'll open it up for discussion.
The 2020 or the 2023, that change reflects the analysis that you referenced last week had been done.
I think it was the 2023, yeah.
2023.
20% increase.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And then, so so last year we did 7%. And I think the COLA plus merit was the same at 5%, or was it 7%?
Last year it was 7+2. So you went with the same COLA with the select board as the regular town employees were getting.
And that was
7.
strictly COLA. There is no merit component because they're not.
Oh, I understand. Okay.
The
so-
voters vote on their performance.
Okay, so 7% was the COLA used last year. I should remember that. Okay, and 3% this year.
Maybe we want to note that on the spreadsheet, Matt.
Yeah, I was assuming that was like the combination.
Right.
And then my next question was gonna be, why aren't we giving them a merit increase? Okay.
Okay. Any other comments from you folks?
Yes, why wouldn't we give them a merit? We did that with other stipends.
Because they're like town employees, and so they actually have, the other departments, they have like a performance review versus the select board members are voted on directly by.
Every 3 years, they get a performance review by the town. The voters vote them in or out.
Okay. Oh, so there's no merit
3
to
years.
base oh, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I understand what
We-
you're
We don't
saying
have
now.
a process for,
Okay.
other than voting them in or out.
Okay,
Um,
thank you.
so the question is, do we want to just accept a 3% COLA increase? Or an argument could be made to set a fixed number of years that we review their compensation. Each 3 years, 5 years, or whatever. And the reason I say that is that the compensation or stipend is not, in my mind, is not intended to compensate these folks for their time. It is in recognition of their service to the town and for the time that they put in. They put in many more hours than the $5,700 or $5,100 represent for those individuals. And thank God they do it. But it's not, in my mind, it's not compensation, it's recognition. And there are always changes going on in town. We have a new town planner this year. Okay, that was an increase in expense last year and this year as a result of having a town planner. One could argue that the town planner actually takes some of the workload off the select board. Conversely, an argument could be made that the town planner generates more work for the select board because they're getting stuff done, requires meetings, et cetera. So I that can go both ways. But there are always changes, and the town has been funding on a regular basis a commitment to increase level of support for the select board. I would be, rather than for the budget committee to struggle with this one every year, or to have an automatic increase every year, because quite frankly, I don't think that looks good for the town, in front of the voters, that the select board are always getting an increase. I would propose that every 3 years, we do a formal review of the select board resources that are provided, level of work, and what surrounding towns of similar size are. And we have a regular process for doing that and determining at that point, should there be an adjustment. So I throw that concept out as discussion.
So be flat, so are saying the flat stipend that would be reevaluated.
3 years, 5 years, 2 years, whatever. Yep. Conceptually, yep. And, as part of that, you take into effect, look at what the inflation's been in the meantime, et cetera. You've heard my reasoning of why I thought about that. the other component of that is I think there just should be a process, a documented process for doing it. So if we're gonna do it every year, we need to be looking at competitive environment every year. If we're reviewing whether they're being paid adequately or rewarded proportionately to what the time they're putting in and what the going rate is for select board stipends in the area, we ought to be doing that every year and not just assuming there's a COLA increase. There ought to be a formal process, just as though there's a formal process with compensation for town employees. Donna, you were, remember well, there wasn't any process for compensation review of employees in town. I mean, that never happened. And so, and it was a disaster. And it was an interesting process putting that one into place. But that process is there now, and I think that we ought to carry that same concept forward in terms of reviewing something periodically, or at least having a procedure for doing that. It can be done every year. I'm not sure I'd support that, but
As far as your suggestion, whether it's done every year or every 2 years, not so much that we're evaluating the performance of this set of select persons, but that we are looking at what the job requires. So it's not a merit, it's not a performance review in that it's about the these specific representative elected officials, but it's more about how have the demands of the role changed, as well as other factors, as you said, how does this compare to other towns? How do we factor in inflation? But the review component is about the role, that's what I'm hearing you say. It's really about the role, not about the people.
correct. And if in fact we find that the demands of the job are requiring, a material amount of additional work or time, or conversely, due to other changes such as bringing on a planning board, a town planner, or other changes within the town that reduce the burden on the select board, that those factors may not be an annual impact, but need to be looked at over time. Because the planning board, the planner in year one is going to take more time. It's just a natural as they come up to speed, and the town figures out how to work with a planner. We've never had one before in that particular type of position. But it may be that year two, he's doing such a good job, he or she, or whoever that person is, that the workload is reduced. Or a new project comes at this that buries the select board, because the town is taking on a whole new initiative on a new building or some such structure that would require even more time. And I think those things need to be looked at over, more broader span than just 12-month period. Okay, now, that being said, I'm not opposed to a 3% COLA increase this year. But with the, if we're implementing a new policy, then we need to develop that policy. And I don't think we can do that just here overnight. Formally develop that policy so that next people on our committee or whatever understand what the process is, and here are the things you want to be looking at. Here's just the way you were looking at compensation or whatever. here's the criteria, here are the things to factor in.
Feedback we get from the
Here's the feedback from the select board, how many hours they're putting in and that sort of stuff, right,
students.
right. And I think that would be helpful too. So,
I like, my reaction. I think what you're proposing is much more thoughtful than. And I have no reservation about having kind of a set stipend. I think it's the stipend, not the people that are being evaluated. Same time, it's just hard for me not to want to give them more money. Because I know how much work they're putting into. But I think what you're proposing is a much more logical, structured way and kind of a fair way to look at the job and decide whether we're compensating. Not, well, we're recognizing, I like how you said that too, it's not so much compensation as it is recognition of the investment they've made. So I like what you're saying, it's hard for me though not to want to give them more this year.
okay,
I agree that I like how thoughtful it is, and I think I support establishing a formal process and outlining that, so that moving forward, there is more sort of rhyme and reason to how these decisions are made. And I think it would also make it much more clear and transparent to the general public. And it would prompt that process to be more documented as well. I also appreciate the language shift from compensation to recognition, because it truly isn't compensation in that there's no way that we can compensate them for their time, because it's not really a job in the way that regular employment is a job. And I think that by having it be shifted toward being more a token of recognition, it does make it less personal and about the unique individuals that hold those roles at any given moment, but rather the position. And I also think, taking into account some of the public comments this evening, when we think about all of the different people in Pownell, justifying, being able to just increase the stipends each year might be a little bit more challenging for everybody to really make sense of and feel that it was justified. Yeah, so I think having a real process makes it more transparent and easier to justify.
start bringing your pets in, okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
I agree. Yeah, I think a more formal process is a great idea. I think, it'd be nice to add some structure. And to your point, Bo, I think for, future budget committees, right? It's great if there's kind of a path that they can go down. The only comment I'd raise is I think, if you're doing more of a lump sum increase to a stipend every 3 years, just potentially the optics around it can potentially be perceived more negatively, right? If you're talking about, oh, we're going to do a 20% increase on, the select board's compensation, that has a different flavor than a 2 or 3% increase that's more steady. So you lose a little bit of flexibility. But I think the process I'm very much on board with.
That's a good point.
that's a good point.
Yeah, you might have.
Yep.
Might actually lead to more negative reaction. Plus, what's the likelihood it would ever be reduced?
Well, the town doesn't.
Possible, but.
Well, it's possible if the budget committee made that recommendation. But in fact, we vote on the total government budget, not that particular line item at town meeting. So it's not likely the town would reduce that amount. Although if they get into a discussion, they could,
Oh, I see what you mean.
See what I
It is
mean.
part of the bigger.
part of the bigger package.
We're not doing the line.
Or if we were to go to a different government structure, so if we didn't have a 3-person select board and rather it was a 5-person or something like that, then the stipend could potentially be reduced per person. If there were more people on the board, right? Aren't there other towns that have more than 3 people on their select board?
Yeah, yep.
Would it
So-
make sense to follow kind of the structure you recommended? Makes sense though to go to that in a year where we defined the process and followed the process. So it said, you know, we've defined this process, this is what we're not gonna be voting on whether this is what the budget committee does to set the stipend of the funding on the warrant. But if what you said before about that, so we would need to actually define a process and what the key components were gonna be and how to do it. Were you thinking we could get that done this year?
No,
So my question is it better for us to move to potentially a zero change in a year where we've actually have defined that process and then followed it and then come in and said, we're recommending zero change to anyone who's at the meeting, well, anyone. Versus this year saying, we're not going to do what we've done in the past, which is pretty much apply a COLA or a bigger adjustment. We're not gonna do that this year, and then we plan to get a process in place. Should we maybe follow what we have done, then get the process in place, and then next year would be the first year that we would operate under that process?
that's an option. I'm gonna ask Becky a question, and that is 3% COLA or 3% COLA component that's applied to other compensation. Who determines what that figure is?
The select board did in January. So I usually go to them as I'm starting to work on the budget, because in our policy, it states that it's COLA, but the select board has discretion over what COLA is. So 3 years ago, things were still unknown. They set it at 3.5%. Then last year, when they were trying to realign and be competitive in wages, they went to 7 to sort of realign us with neighboring towns. And this year, we looked at Social Security. It was 3.2 in January, so they went with 3 and just sort of stayed with that. So it comes from them in January.
Yeah, because there are any number of definitions of cost of living increase or cost of living
Yep.
adjustment.
Right.
You know, depends on what indice you're using. You know, if you're factoring in just, you know, energy or, you know, whatever cost.
Solid waste and recycling.
Solid waste, yeah, that one scares me, by the way. If that's the indice they're using, it's gonna be a big impact to the town. So let me throw out another option, and it's somewhat in line with what you were suggesting. And that is that we could set a policy right now and say, look, we're gonna taking into account what Matt expressed and that concern, which I think is a reasonable one. We could say, look, we're gonna basically match the COLA as a policy, unless we have a really good reason not to. We will be matching. Let me rephrase this. In the interim years, we will match COLA increases every 3 years, which happens to coincide with select board terms, not any specific ones. It ends up doing that in effect, but the 3-year period can be justified, I think, because that's how long a select board member is a select board member. I'm sure there's a lot of logic there, but
I get what you're
these
saying.
matches
That's a
up.
reasonable, right?
So we could say we're gonna
Term.
do COLA on the interim years, and then every 3 years, look at is the stipend does there need to be adjustment because of changes in workload,
I like that.
Is it,
the world, you know?
is it a conflict that, or does it matter that the select board themselves is the one that establishes COLA?
Well, we can have an internal policy to go with that unless we see a good reason not to. But at least it says, look, okay, we're comfortable with a COLA unless something else is.
We could say something like the lesser of COLA or like, inflation. I don't know if it'll make a difference.
Yeah, I was just thinking if we match what other compensation is, the optics may be a little bit better, just saying everybody's getting a 3% increase. It's just, that's,
Yeah. I agree with what you laid out, Bo. I think that makes sense.
but that's a policy for the budget committee as a guideline, instead of a policy, it's a guideline for the budget committee. That in general, we would look at in the interim years, match the COLA increase for the excuse me, that's being proposed for the rest of town. And then every 3 years, look at the broader issue.
Do a review.
Make sense?
To just respond to Jennifer's question. So when they set COLA, they're really setting it for me so I can do employee compensation. Because last year you sort of followed suit for a realignment of their stipends with the 7% COLA. That's what I used this year, but it really is your discretion when it comes to the select board stipend, what you're gonna set. So it's not necessarily a conflict because when they're setting it, they're not setting it for their pay, they're setting it for me to do the department budgets.
The other stipended positions are animal control.
Fire chief. And so before it was deputy fire chief, but they've split that out and they now have structures. They have 2 captains position and a lieutenant's position, I think was the third one that are stipend. So before it was fire chief, deputy chief doing it. Now it's going to be split across 4 people. So the recording secretary is a little bit different. We hired an employee, but the planning board does get stipends too every year. Last year was the first year that they got them. So chair gets 1,000, regular voting members get 500, and the planning board secretary, which is different from the recording secretary, gets an additional 500 in her stipends.
Is there an established process around those other stipend positions?
So the fire chief and the ACO follow suit as like myself because they get a performance eval. The planning board, because it's only really been established for a year, there isn't a policy yet to look at that, but having this discussion, it brings it to the forefront that we probably should. And there's turnover in that too. So, so it would be really about the workload, and bringing on the town planner is really diverting the workload away. So they're just supposed to be looking at applications for the most part and giving recommendations on ordinance changes, but that ordinance work is moving away from them and more towards the town planner. So that was the hopes there. But it's a good point that we should probably establish a similar policy with those stipends because it is a new one. This is only our 2nd year with them.
So that would be an opportunity then for us to maybe propose a process that we think is reasonable to use every 3 years with the select board and then work with the select board on adopting a similar proposal to be used for the other stipends, which we don't set, but they do. We get to comment on, right? Or we get to support or not.
Well, the planning board stipend would be separate. In the compensation, that includes the ACO, the fire chief,
Right.
and so that's in or it's in the fire chief's
But the
compensation.
select board would be, if there were a process, they'd be executing that process.
Correct.
We'd be executing the process for the select board stipend.
Correct.
Right? So they'd have, hopefully they'd be similar processes, but.
And if we come up, if we come up with a policy that we're comfortable with, COLA every year on stipends and, every 3 years, a full review. We could say, here's our policy, you might want to apply it to
Yeah.
the planning board.
Well, I think it just takes the guesswork out of everything too,
Right.
really, honestly. It just makes it, right.
Right, and not only here's the policy that we're following, but here are the criteria. Here's the tool that you can use to
Yep.
do that with.
I think that is a great solution because actually, if you look back, that is kind of what's happened. We followed COLA and then in that 1 year, there was an analysis done and an adjustment made. But if you, the point you're both making, you don't, if you're just looking at these numbers, you don't know that's what happened. You don't know that it actually has been consistent. So that if we put essentially what we've been doing down and make that a policy, our own committee policy, then we can explain it. People can disagree with it. They can challenge us on it. But at least it doesn't look random. And if you look at these numbers, it looks very random.
Yeah, and historically, there was not a lot of review of stipends. It was, I mean, they're not high to begin with.
No, I know.
So they
Right.
were never high and they were never adjusted for years
Right.
and years, so. Oh, go ahead.
In our defense, at least for the last 3 years, they're on par. Right? Like before that, they weren't really on par, but at least for the last 3 years, they're on par with surrounding towns of our size with government structured like ours, I think was what we were mostly looking at.
Right.
It's a good thing you did that work.
So I would propose that the Budget Committee adopt a policy that in absence of any other significant information, that it do a formal review of stipends, of select board stipends every 3 years. And the intervening years, the increase would be equal to the COLA that the other general compensated employees are subject to.
Sort of, for qualified COLA, that will match, unless they're reducing much.
Yeah, well, I tried to say, like, in absence of any other information, that was my CYA language. Wiggle language, let's put it that way, it's better.
I second the proposal.
And that implies that we would agree to a 3% increase this year. And that if asked, then we could respond with, this is our policy.
I guess a clarifying note, would the 3-year review happen from the last kind of market adjustment in 23? Or would it be 3 years starting after this year?
I would say beginning next year,
We would do a review next year.
we would do a review every 3 years. Good point.
Makes sense.
And so we've just made more work for ourselves by saying we need to come up with a procedure, but that can be done.
That's next year's problem.
Excuse me?
It's next year's problem.
It would be our first meeting on the first meeting's agenda.
Right, that's something that we can circulate internally and then take a formal vote on it at our next meeting. Or not our next meeting, but the first meeting in the fall. Okay, yeah, let's vote on that. Okay, so any further discussion? Hearing none. I make a motion that the Budget Committee adopt that policy as previously articulated.
I'll second, yeah.
Okay.
Just a quick note, do we want to add in the 3% this year too? I guess it's covered by the policy. Okay, yeah,
Yeah, covered.
okay.
Well, no, I think, inclusive of a COLA increase of 3% this year, I think it's good to have the specific. Because they're saying, starting next year, we'll start with this policy. Yeah, we just skipped a year. Yeah. Okay, any further discussion? We comfortable with what we're proposing at this point? Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye, opposed? Nay. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the total general government budget as proposed, and originally presented by Becky of $564,171. It's a 4.1% increase for the year. Any discussion on the total at this point? Okay, I'll move that the Budget Committee support, recommend $564,171 be spent on general government.
Second.
We have a second. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Unanimous. Thank you very much. I think it's good to get a policy in place and,
Yeah,
the,
Bonus.
thank you. Yeah.
Bonus work.
Okay, and that is it, I think, on the budget recommendations that we have to vote on tonight. So the question is, do we feel that we need the meeting next Monday night, the 1st? And I will tell you, well, it's not next Monday, but April 1st, I'm sorry. Now, you're saying that the select board next Monday will be starting to talk about the warrant articles.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Okay. I am unable to make next Monday's meeting. So I have a board meeting at FCS. So, if we could have somebody from the Budget Committee there, it would be helpful. Just to be able to answer any questions they might have. And also to just be aware of any issues that may be coming up on warrant articles. If not, Becky can certainly apprise me of issues, and I'm really thinking more from a moderator standpoint, I confess.
Most of what I'm gonna be going over is making sure I put the placeholders in, like future facility has a placeholder that I'm waiting on the language. Do they want to put that unassigned, and what does that figure look like? The Freeport Scholarship, she came and presented, so I need to check on that. So it's really gonna be like, okay, this is what I've gotten from all my notes over the last few months. What am I missing? What other things? It's in a very rough state, I should say, like as rough form at this point. I'm also waiting on the planning boards, all of their ordinances too. So there's a chance that the April 22nd public hearing is going to get pushed into April 29th. Because I am not here on April 8th, and that would be when the draft budget warrant would really be in almost final presentation for that April 22nd public hearing, but I have a feeling we're gonna be pushed back a week on it.
Just my, having heard that, I'm not convinced that anybody from the Budget Committee needs to be there at that point.
Yeah.
For the next meeting.
Yeah, you would probably be fine. It's really to make sure that I haven't forgotten something that should be, look at what I've got on there right now, check some dates, make sure, spelling, things like that I've gotten, because I won't even have the budget recommendations because they still need to vote on their recommendations. So that piece isn't even done yet.
Good point.
So we don't need coverage.
I don't think so.
The coverage would really be on the April 8th, maybe because I would probably be sending them more of a slightly finer tuned warrant, which would have hopefully the recommendations in, because I'm hoping they're gonna vote on them on the 25th. And then I'm not gonna be here for that meeting, so if there's any feedback or question.
So do you anticipate anything, sounds like no, but anything happening at that meeting on the 25th that we would then need to consider in one more extra meeting on April 1st?
I don't think there's anything. I think the only thing you have really left to consider is your annual report. That's really only your last task.
And I think we can do that offline.
right?
Yep.
I don't see a need for a specific meeting for that.
Yeah, I don't think you need one.
Okay,
Good.
so we'll scratch the meeting for April 1st. Which eliminates one conflict I had too, so that's good. Okay,
Or probably that work will flow into April.
No, I think the public hearing for April 22nd would not happen. And it would have to be maybe the 29th to keep us in check for May. So it'd be an off select board night. Normally, these are scheduled on a select board meeting, but I need to have them sign it by the second meeting in May to make it into the annual report in time. So I've got only a 2-week wiggle room really in April to move the public hearings around, and I'm just not sure I'm gonna have all the language needed to have something in a final phase by April 8th. That's really only a couple of weeks away, so.
you're thinking that the 22nd may get pushed to the 29th.
Yeah, that's one of item we're gonna be discussing over the next couple of select board meetings too. I had already sort of pre-mentioned it to the chair of the select board that this is a possibility, so.
So what was the April meeting that was in between? April 8th?
April 8th, yeah,
Okay. So we should probably be, somebody should probably be at that meeting.
just in case there's anything on the.
Can you do that, Bo, or do you?
Yeah,
need-
I'm okay on that.
Yeah, okay.
And I've got that on my calendar, so.
Perfect.
Because yeah, I am. Okay.
And if the 22nd got pushed to the 29th, that would be good for me.
No-
I'll make a note of
So
that.
Not to be selfish about it, but. Okay. Good. So lacking any other disasters, this will be our last meeting. I want to thank you all for your work. Very thoughtful discussions. I think the town is better off because of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Bo, for your leadership, great questions, keeping us on track. You're terrific at this. Thank you.
And obviously, thanks to Becky. Although it goes without saying, but we're going to say it anyway. Thank you. We could not do it without you.
No kidding.
And
Great committee to work.
and each year, we continue to improve the process. It's a process, not an event, as they say.
You should pat yourself on the back. We did it in 4 meetings this year.
No, it's. very
Yeah, that's
impressive.
great.
Although that last one was long.
Well, yes, that one was long. We'll work on that.
Meeting that's. What's helpful to like start to think about things and obviously.
Great.
And really get the down. In the like better terms of it, I think that that should be about the shift.
I agree.
I would agree. Something else occurred to me. We're gonna need to develop the procedure for the
Yeah.
review of the stipends, between now and then.
Yeah.
So is there somebody that would like to take the lead on that? And, kind of work on an outline and then start circulating something we can chime in on?
I will.
Okay, We're,
I was gonna say, I really.
you can't, okay. Okay.
Yes, if any,
And-
Matt?
Yeah, that's fine.
I'll start it.
Okay, and I'll work with you on it.
Okay, yeah.
And, you know, we can also, you know, work with other folks here in town to develop that procedure.
great.
So, and so that it's, you know, it can be, again, with the idea that it's you know, it's a process that could be applied to planning board stipend as well. Keep that in mind as we go through it.
Okay. Great.
How many members now?
5 regular members and 2 alternates. The alternates are not stipend, but they become voting members if one of the regular members is absent from a meeting. And then if someone decides not to continue their term, then they move up to a regular and then we look for alternates. So there's always someone to step in to have those regular members always filled, those roles.
The Future Facilities Committee is actually meeting with the select board, what do we call it, a working meeting? Workshop, thank you. I knew there was a word for it. Tomorrow night. And that's at 6:30, correct? And the Future Facilities Committee does not have a final report yet, but we are going to be updating the select board as to where we are in that process and what our findings generally are before we formalize them. And with a small presentation, and you all are welcome if you'd like to come. It's not mandatory by any stretch of the imagination, but being a workshop, it will not be recorded. So
I will not be in attendance tomorrow night.
you will not be.
I will not be here.
Okay, good. Well, we can talk about you then.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I can't make that commitment because I'm just one member of the committee. The presentation is really just, you know, hitting the highlights, and there's a lot of talking points behind it that we're not, you know, not putting on paper yet until our final report. So I would suggest that you wait to the final report. But really, what the committee, the Future Facilities Committee is really saying, look, this is where we are. You know, we're about to wrap this thing up. But you're gonna have to start making some decisions to which way the town wants to go with this, or what the next steps are. So, you know, we're about to hit a wall, and, you know, with what our charge was, and basically complete what the charge was, but it could be that we end up with a need for some funding for the next step. But we don't know what that next step is. So that's one of the reasons we just need to get together with the select board and talk about that process. But we're still waiting on a environmental site assessment on the property next door, which will determine, you know, may determine the suitability of that piece of property, or what remediation, you know, action may be necessary if you try to use that piece of property. So that could impact the final report of the consultant that we've got, Port City Architecture, their proposal. So.
Or more? Or more?
No, just the two. Two and the moderator, yeah.
Do you want to, are we ready to adjourn?
If no further discussion, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn at 8:28. I don't see any dissension. We're adjourned.